Our first presentation of the morning is LCMPT Turns 10, Contemplating the Present and Future of Faceted Description in Music Cataloging. Casey Mullin is our presenter, and he is the head of cataloging and metadata services at Western Washington University and managing partner of the firm Flourish Music Metadata Solution. Casey holds a bachelor and master's degrees in music from WWU and a master's of library science from Indiana University, Bloomington. Casey has served as chair of the Music OCLC Users Group, the MLA Vocabularies Subcommittee, and the ALA Core SAC Subcommittee on Faceted Vocabularies. He is currently the chair of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging Policy Committee. Outside of librarianship, Casey is active as a freelance violinist, violist, and pianist. So please welcome Casey. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm going to try this because I'm tall and I hate hunching over on a podium. But if I get too far, just let me know and I'll bring it back. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, MOUG, for having me, and thank you for giving me a luxurious 50-minute session. I will try to not talk the whole time because I really do want to have time for discussion at the end. So, LCMPT, the Medium of Performance Thesaurus, is 10 years old this month. Cannot believe it. I also can't believe we were in this very room 8 years ago. Time has no meaning. So I'm going to do a bit of an hourglass. I'm going to start a little broad, give a little history lesson. I'm going to then zoom in and talk about a project that I'm working on of sort of my own individual contribution to the cause, to the war effort. And then I'm going to zoom back out, and we're going to hopefully have a rousing discussion about what is next and what does the future look like for this area of music cataloging. So, for a lot of us, this section is going to be a history lesson and a walk down memory lane. But for our colleagues who have joined our community more recently, this may be some kind of interesting overview for you. But let's get started. So what have the last 10 years looked like? So actually, we're going to go back 15 years. So the year is 2008. So we have LCSH, we apply it dutifully. We have the instruction sheets, most famously 1917.5, has all the instructions about order of instruments and all of that. We also have some MARC fields to put codes in, and some people use them a bit more than others. A few libraries actually use them for discovery. The rest of us kind of just are along for the ride. Everyone, I think we can all assume that every music cataloger, at least that is in this organization, in this room, or in this Zoom room, hi Zoom room, we all want the best for our high quality metadata, and we want to be able to describe the music that we're cataloging as thoroughly and eloquently as we can. And in 2008, facet-based catalogs are becoming more common. They hadn't quite made it to the level of ubiquity they are today, but they were, we had the beginnings of Viewfind and Blacklight and some other platforms that are really prevalent today. So faceting sort of starts to become an organizing principle. And in the faceted world, LCSH just doesn't work in quite the same way when browsing is de-emphasized, so frustrations grow. I have to say that at this point, I feel like defenses of the LCSH or any attempt to tout it is really tinged with a sense of Stockholm syndrome because it's bad. It just doesn't work. In my opinion, I'm editorializing a little bit, but I could go on about this part of the presentation all day, but I'm just going to give a couple of pet examples. You don't get any instrument ranges. You get some instrument ranges, but only if there's one or two instruments, and then if you have three or more, it's not a bass clarinet anymore, it's just a clarinet. No vocal ranges. Well, you get three, high, medium, low. That's it. And if you have two or more solo voices, you don't get to indicate range at all. Sorry. 10 or more instruments, and you get an encompassing ensemble term. But if you have an accompanying ensemble with a soloist, then 2 or more instruments, and you get an all-encompassing ensemble term. Now, there's a couple of carve-outs for that, but basically, in this example, songs with instrumental ensemble, even if you only have a piano and one other instrument, you got to call it an instrumental ensemble. Poor Chopin. For some reason, Nocturnes has never been an LCSH heading. I don't know why, it just never made it in. Fantasia is a topical heading, but the genre heading Fantasias, plural, never made it in. We have codes for them. And as we can see a little later, that comes in handy when we're trying to go back later and put faceted data in. And then we have the question of inconsistent application. And if you watched MOUG this week, you saw we had a conversation come out resulting from a change of H1160 and the question of, well, now that we can put subfield V scores or whatever on any old heading, what does that mean for consistency, and how do we even do consistency at this point in the game? Plus, there's all of the other ways that LCSH can be done wrong. So this is all for users, right? Well, do we care about our users? I don't know. Does LCSH help them? We have cases where we have a topical heading and a form heading, and they're almost identical, but one's singular and one's plural. Does the user know which is which? Can we even remember ourselves? Sometimes it's hard. We have other headings where if you make a topical, you put subfield X on it. But what happens in a faceted environment when your subject subfields get pulled apart and put into different facets? What happens? Then you don't have that sort of context to be able to show a topical heading versus a form heading. So that makes it more difficult. Even when you want to do some precise, when you have the ability to do a precise instrumentation search like cello and piano, well, you have to tell your user if they're going to use the browse list, they have to go to all these different places to find music for those two instruments. Because most of them will start with cello, but some of them start with sonatas or rondos. But then there are forms that you can't add the medium after to as well. And so trying to explain users that. Good luck. It was a dark time, but nevertheless, we persisted. So a year later, MLA charges a new task force. And actually, there was work that happened long before this task force, but this is when the work really started to ramp up. We started in 2009. We were led by Beth Eiseminger, and then later on, Nancy Lorimer rotated on. She brought us to the finish line. I looked back and saw our charge when we were first formed, and I let out a loud laugh because I could not believe we thought we would be done by July 2009. Well, at least the first phase. So, first thing we did was reality sets in. We shaved back the timeline. We separated our efforts into the genre form side and the medium side. At first, we thought we would be comprehensive, and we looked for terminology in all of these places. And particularly in the Garland Encyclopedia, that turned out to be a bit of a garden path because there's just trying to model the whole world and create a thesaurus with how many thousands of terms turned out to be more than we could handle. So we wound up sort of shaving it back again and trying to be more based on literary warrant, at least in terms of the first release of LCMPT and of the music terms of LCGFT. But of course, these vocabularies could be living and be added to over time, but we had to sort of have a viable starting place. So we decided to do that. There was a lot of work over 6 years. We had to organize everything into a hierarchy. If it's a true thesaurus, it has to be hierarchical. There can be no orphan terms. So we had lots of conversations about different ways of organizing things. There's the Hornbostel-Zaks way of organizing the world of instruments. But there's also common terms like string instruments, wind instruments, woodwind. So we came up with a way of sort of modeling both of those things. We also have, in the genre form area, we have this idea of art versus popular versus folk music. That distinction doesn't work for everything, but it works for some things, and so we made some decisions about where to put things in the hierarchy. We did our best to mitigate Western-centric bias. There's still lots of more work to do, but with the new vocabularies gave us a fresh start. We presented about it in 2019. There were MARC format changes along the way that let us say what we wanted to say, particularly with the 382 field for medium of performance. It's in a pretty good place now with all of the tweaking we've done over the years, but of course it's MARC. There'll be more tweaking in the future, I'm sure. But then we have all of these other fields for the various other facets, geographic and genre form and demographic and chronological. And another thing that slowed this project down was that everything had to go through LC's protocols for getting terms approved and input into their Minaret system and all of that. And so we were very lucky to have LC colleagues on the group that really did the yeoman's work of pushing this through. It was a long saga, but we did it. And then finally, we established mechanisms for continued growth of the vocabularies, which now is what we call the Seiko music funnel. So you'll be hearing more about that later this week at the MLA Town Hall if you attend that. So we're ready for implementation. 10 years ago, LCMPT was released, the first 800 or so terms. A year later, the music terms in LCGFT were released. The Genre Reform Task Force was able to be discharged in 2016. Even though we were effectively done in 2015, we were officially discharged a year later. The newly reorganized vocabularies subcommittee, which was part of the reorganized CMC, took over all of the follow-up work, or most, if not all of it, including ongoing vocabulary building, best practices, and retrospective implementation efforts. We'll come back to that. And to this day, vocabs is still carrying the water on all of those. And in 2015, we had the all-day workshop at MOUG. So again, that's 9 years ago. I still can't believe that. I could go on and on. I won't. I promise this is not a shameless plug. This is a disclaimer that I glossed over a lot of details. So if you'd like to read the whole story, please go see this article. Okay. All right, now we're going to jump to the present and a little bit of the recent past. I have a couple more background things to share, but I want to talk about some work that I've done locally to kind of keep the fires burning and to keep us moving along towards full implementation. So, like I said, current implementation was pretty much well underway as soon as we had that 2015 workshop. The best practices documents were available, the MARC fields were all valid in connection, and everything was set to go. So I would say between then and now, we can take for granted that faceted vocabs are a part of current cataloging practice. For the most part, there may be occasional cases where records appear in WorldCat that don't have 382s and 655s, but generally current cataloging is now using the faceted approach in addition to everything else. And we have it's not just medium and genre, we have other facets that to take into account as well. We have chronological data in 046 and in 388, for which we now have best practices issued by the ALA subcommittee on faceted vocabularies. And that includes being able to say when something was composed and indicating dates that are distinct from other dates, like dates of publication. We have demographic data that we can encode both for audience in the 385 and creator and contributor characteristics in 386. And we have a place for non-topical geographic terms in 370. So the ability to basically say this piece was composed in this country or created in this place. And so then, what happens to LCSH? That's the big question. That's the theme of today's talk. What do we do with LCSH? So essentially, I would say there's an asterisk here because there are edge cases and there are things that LCSH still does that aren't quite replicated in the faceted approach yet. But for the most part, these H1917.5 style headings, their function is now superseded by faceted vocabularies, or at the very least duplicated. But we can't consider ourselves having fully implemented unless we get everything into all of the legacy records. Well, what do we do for that? So MLA Vocabs has done a lot of work in this area. They developed an algorithm that takes the syntax of LCSH headings and takes some other codes in the MARC format and then spits out medium terms and genre form terms. We worked with Gary Strawn, who came up with a connection-based macro that does all of this at the push of a button. It's quite slick. We presented on it in 2018, and the vocab subcommittee continues to work with Gary to refine it and make it better over time. And some other large-scale testing and implementation, aside from the OCLC Music Toolkit, is starting to happen. I don't hear a whole lot about what's going on. I do know that BYU did a project to update over 300,000 records. We heard about that at the 2020 MOOC presentation. If anyone else in this and within the sound of my voice has success stories, I would love to hear them. I would love to hear what other places are doing to get more faceted data into more records. Okay, back to the ALA subcommittee. They put out a couple of foundational documents. One of them, which we call the white paper, is basically kind of a call to action that says, okay, if we really want a faceted future, this is what it's going to take. And it outlines all the work that needs to happen in terms of what catalogers need to do, what administrators need to do, what policy-making bodies need to do. And there's still, this many years later, there's still a lot from that white paper that has not been addressed yet, but we continue, the ALA group continues to champion for that cause. They also, I should say I'm on the group. We also came out with a a set of best practices on retrospective implementation. Now, if you haven't had a chance to look at these, this is not a set of code like what Gary would use or what Gary would base his toolkit on. This is a set of mapping specifications and of kind of high-level considerations that is intended to provide a blueprint for programmers to actually write programs to do it. Because there's so many different environments that people work in, and every database is different. Different platforms where you manage metadata have different requirements. And so rather than try to get into the weeds with a specific program, we wanted to come out with some high-level specifications. So this is a modular approach. So as we work on individual modules, that we will re-release the toolkit in order to give people more tools to get more faceted data out of their existing data in their MARC records. Okay, so beyond MLA, what's been done? So we have a couple of modules in the ALA toolkit are completed. LCSH form subdivisions are all mapped to the extent possible, their LCGFT counterparts. And in some cases, there's some demographic terms that you can get out of, like when you have subfield V juvenile, things like that, and fixed field codes as well. So now we can have Festriften, finally. We couldn't have that before for some reason in a subject heading. The modules that are in progress right now, the literature headings are being worked on, and literary headings are kind of analogous to music headings in that they often combine multiple facets in one string. So you have like, French poetry. So poetry that comes out of France or created by French people, but it also has the genre of poetry. So there are actually two separate modules looking at that. One's looking at the genre form piece, and the other's looking at the demographic and geographic piece. And SSFE has been partnering with OCLC a little bit. We're still early days with this. We worked with Robert Bremer until his retirement, and then more lately we've been working with Brian Baldus, who actually has been helping us test some of these mappings. And we recently found out that the QC macro that is used to kind of maintain WorldCat records, they've actually put some of these mappings into the operational macro. So the hope is that as we continue to do more testing, things will sort of graduate into that status, and there will be more data across multiple disciplines appearing in more WorldCat records, so that catalogers don't have to do it. And there's lots of potential here for AI and machine learning applications. I know that's a really hot topic right now, but this is something that we've thought about for a little while, and it's just a matter of finding the right people to work on it. I have been contacted by a possible grant project PI on looking at broader than just music across different disciplines of like the potential for AI and doing some of this mapping and work for us. So again, to take the burden off of the manual application. Now, while we wait for all of these magical things to unfold, there's kind of an organic process already happening over time. More and more WorldCat records do include these faceted terms, which is great. The new things going in, obviously, thanks to the people in this community, as well as other libraries upgrading records over time as they have occasion to. We don't have a magic button. We would we thought that I think when we came out with Gary's tool, it does kind of work as a single button thing, but there's so much review and massaging that is required of it. It's not quite a single button solution. It's not an easy button yet. But it's fun to think about that maybe in certain circumstances we could have kind of a magic button solution for getting some of these types of data into our records. But the music toolkit is, like I said, is still being worked on and refined by the vocab subcommittee. The idea when we first developed it was that it would be a productivity tool, which is it got picked up for use for that immediately. And a lot of people are using it, which is great. But it was also intended from the get-go to be a testing ground as well, as a way to say what can be automated, what can't be automated, what needs human review, like what do we decide is the most crucial components to give to a human versus to let a machine handle. But so stay tuned on that. I think that there's still a lot of work that can be done in that area. But in the meantime, we have other facets that are part of the picture. I know, again, in music, we focus on medium and genre, but there are the other facets as well to keep in mind and ways of getting more of that kind of data into our records. So, this is my story about how to eat an elephant, and who remembers how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. This is my story of eating an elephant one bite at a time. I don't eat land animals, but it's, call it a tofu elephant, I guess. Okay, so in 2018, I rotated off the vocab subcommittee, so I kind of stepped away and handed off the reins to my successor. And the work is still going on, but I wanted a way to stay involved, even though I was off the group. So I love the toolkit, and I use it every single day. And so I just thought, well, how do I scale this up, and what can I do, use some of my discretionary time to move the ball forward on this effort. So there are a couple of things that make this project feasible in my shop. One is that we use Alma. I'm not here. One is that we use Alma, and we have an integration profile with OCLC. So we do, by policy, we do all of our bib editing in OCLC. We only use a limited set of local fields. So all of the cataloging work that we do, both original and upgrading, is done in OCLC. So there's a benefit for the whole community. So the work that we do to upgrade records, then that work is available to other members of the OCLC community. So that kind of gave me a rationale to work on this project that would benefit my local catalog, but also the entire community. So I started with low-hanging fruit. It's always good with a project to come up with a place to start. As you heard, I'm a string player, so I started with string music. I first looked at scores and then sound recordings. I then later went back to scores, and because there's so many more sound recording bibs in my catalog, I thought there are relatively fewer score records. So if I just look at the scores as the first phase of this project, then maybe I can have a chance of actually completing it. I did some experimenting early on with MARC Edit and the WorldCat metadata API, where, outside of Gary's toolkit, there are other ways to program, deriving faceted data, and I did a little bit of experimenting with that with the help of Kelly McGrath, who you'll hear from tomorrow at MLA if you attend our session. More could be done in this area. I think that what I'm glad to see that vocabs is doing is they're looking at universalizing the algorithm so that it's not just bound up in one program. As great as Gary's program is, it's one program, and there are other ways to look at this. So I'm glad that more work can be done in this area. Oops. Okay. There's some other long-term projects that this kind of fit in with. So we all know about 240s and how 240 fields don't ever get automatically updated still. So when there are changes to authority records and things can fall out of sync, really, as far as I know, there's no other way except to manually find things and fix them. So I took on a project that involved fixing 100 240 combinations for certain musical works, particularly things that have like quartet strings. I found all of those and knocked them out. And so this was, the intersection is that I was already touching these records anyway. So I thought, while I'm touching these records, I'll do the full shebang and also get the faceted fields in. I also have an ongoing effort to get all of the M-level records out of my catalog, which by merging them into better records or upgrading them. So these are kind of some longer term things that this fits into. So, like I said, like once you have occasion, once you're looking at a record, once you're in it, once you're in the dirt, then there are a lot of things that you can do. There are lots of access points that can be corrected. There are missing access points or access points that can be added. I found a lot of older score records that don't have editors that could have editors, things like that. Splitting up those multi-language AAPs, getting rid of the English ampersand German and having separate 700s, which is the current practice. Other coding updates that again are kind of low-hanging fruit. But the main thing that this project is concerned with is taking the music toolkit's output and massaging it and making it ready for prime time. Well, we all know what happened in March 2020. Suddenly, and I know that everyone had a different situation, but in my situation, I suddenly had more discretionary time for a little while. And I was at home, and there were fewer things to catalog, at least for a good several months before we got that workflow going again. So I had a little bit more time, so I was able to accelerate my efforts a little bit. I also took the opportunity to learn how to write macros in Connection, which is something that was kind of on my bucket list for a while, and I am not a macro writing expert, but I know a little bit now and enough to be dangerous, and I was able to kind of beef up and enhance Gary's macro by adding a couple of my own. So I wrote one that creates an 046 out of the 045, subfield B. I wrote another one that creates a 13-digit ISMN based on a 10-digit ISMN. And then I wrote this meta macro, which I didn't know this. You could write a macro that takes multiple other macros. And then with one click, you can run a set of multiple macros on the same record. So I did that, and then I presented on this to the OCLC cataloging community a couple of years ago. And I have a video in a second. You can see how it works. So the workflow is that first I identify what records need enhancement. And the main way that I've done this is with command line searching. So I've been generally going one instrument at a time. So I started with strings, violin, viola, cello, bass. And then I moved on to the other orchestral instruments and then kind of on from there. And then I moved into vocal music, which is a lot more complicated. And then the other method is to use indication rules in ALMA to then take a snapshot and find out how many records in my catalog currently do not have a 382. And so I can identify records that way. And so once I have those records identified, I then can start working on them. And if there's a batch search involved, I'll save them to the local file. But generally, I'll take a set of a couple dozen records at a time, put them in my save file, and then I run my meta macro, and it runs all of the macros on it at once. And then I go in and review and refine the results. Nothing gets replaced without manual review, of course. That's the basic requirement. Here's a little video of how it works. Okay, so I have a user tool. I had to click it twice because connection's finicky. Okay, it took that second time. See, it's running 3 different macros, but not every macro is applicable to every record. But it goes through. On my work computer, it's pretty fast. It's a little slower on my home computer, but it works on anywhere you have connection set up, as long as you're connected to OCLC. All right, and then I go into the 4th record, and I'm going to show you. See, we have the 046 that was generated, and then we have the 382, which is very inadequate. But then I would go in and enhance that 382, and then control the 655s and do all the other things. So that's basically what the process looks like. Oh, no, we're going. There we go. Okay, so what are some examples of massaging that I do, some common things? Well, as I said before, if it's a tenor saxophone, I go in and say that. Because the toolkit's only going to give me what's in the 650. So if it's a specific range, I will put that in. If it's a specific accompanying ensemble and it's not terribly large and I can enumerate it, I will do that. And I can also make the voice more specific. So if it's an actual soprano and not just any high voice. Sometimes I'll keep the toolkit generated field. Sometimes I'll take it out. It depends on the situation. Like with percussion, we have sort of the threefold approach where you can say the number of percussionists, you can say the term percussion ensemble, and you can even give all of the individual percussion instruments. I only did that in cases where it was very clear, like this player has this instrument and this player has this instrument. Otherwise, I usually didn't bother. There are genre terms that you can't get out of subject headings because they're kind of implicit, like solo instrument music. Well, they're not always art music, but if it's a piano piece and you can tell it's art music, you can add art music. I will add other faceted fields that are kind of apparent from the description. So sometimes there are dates of composition that appear in a note that they're, so I can just kind of grab that and add an 046 for it. Text strings are another area that I had underutilized before this project, but as you can see, I have a lot of examples of text strings where rather than having to type out, soprano voice, alto voice, tenor voice, bass voice, mixed chorus, orchestra, I can have a single click and get that in there. So, all right, there are limitations. This work is being done without an item in hand, so there are caveats associated with that. So there are things that are really straightforward that you can tell from the record that a field is appropriate. But then there are cases where you might have a compilation with different instruments, or it's not clear what instruments are involved. Maybe it's folk music and it just says something like folk tunes. Well, then the LCMPT allows us to be very generic, and MARC allows us to give a partial statement. So there are cases where all I can say is, these are songs, so there's probably at least one singer, so I can give 38211 singer. But something's better than nothing. There are compromises and guardrails associated with these limitations. So essentially, every record is a tactical moment. It's like, what can I do quickly that is going to be accurate, that is not going to, not going to make the record worse, or somehow put incorrect data in? What can I say that I'm confident about versus what would I need to do more research on or even retrieve the item? In cases where the item needs to be retrieved, occasionally I'll do that, and if not, then I put it off to the later pile. I have some deferred projects that I work on as time allows, but for the most part, I'm focusing on what can be done quickly. And then, let's not forget it's WorldCat. Other people will come along someday and fill in the gaps if I'm not able to do everything. But the big takeaway is that accurate and incomplete is better than wrong and at an attempt to be complete. So, as I work on this, there's a frontier where MLA best practices sort of doesn't cover every situation. And there are situations that, well, maybe, when I can get my head together and submit some suggestions to add to the best practices. I haven't done that yet. I'm still kind of thinking about, what would be worth doing. But there are things like, currently the MLA best practices say if you have a dramatic work, you can leave out the 382. But also, you can say things like, well, if it's a standard rep opera, it has some number of soloists and chorus, and if it's a vocal score, there's a piano involved. So there are things you can say, even if the best practices doesn't require you to do it. Like I said, there are broad compilations where sometimes a really generic 382, like singer or instrument. How useful is that? I don't know, but again, it's there. It can be built on later. And then there's questions about when is it good to add demographic terms? So far, I've limited adding demographic data to cases where it's already present in the LCSH. So if it's a compilation of music by a certain people group, then that's a case where I can just pull it out and add a 386. But I'm generally not going out of my way to say, okay, every Chopin record was created in France or something like that. I haven't gone to those lengths. So how's it going? Well, again, this is a many years project, and just to try to keep consistent, I try to get a few dozen of these in a day, not every day. It depends on how busy I am with other things. This is certainly not my full-time job. I track statistics. I take a monthly snapshot. I use ALMA indication rules to be able to see how many records at a given moment have these fields in them, and then I can see how much farther I have to go. So one of the big questions is, where's the finish line? How will I know when I'm done? Well, so as I said, I'm currently focusing on scores, and I think that every score record could have at least one genre term, because if it has some kind of format of notated music, and it has some kind of music in it. So I think 100% for that, but for 382, maybe not 100%, but probably pretty close to it. I think most things can have some kind of medium statement. And for sound recordings, it's going to be a different animal, and I'll reassess when I get to that phase 2 of the project. What drives this forward? Again, long projects can be hard to keep motivated. Well, there's the chicken and egg problem of people saying, well, we won't turn this facet on because there's not enough data in that field, or we won't display it because not every record has it. Well, sometimes the only way around that problem is just to brute force and get more data into the records. I also feel a duty to the profession, as someone who is a champion of faceted approach, and particularly in music. I wouldn't have much credibility if I wasn't rolling up my sleeves and doing a lot of this in my own work. And finally, we do have facets configured for medium of performance and the other facets. And so I get to see my work, the work playing out in that venue as well. So here's the progress. The top line of the graph is all the score records. That big bump is when we had Alexander Street for a while. Then those came out, we had a trial. And then the bottom line is the number of records that actually have a 382 in them. So as you can see, we're getting pretty close to 100%. And this is the graph looking at 655, specifically LCGFT, because there are other, we have fast terms that have 655s and things like that. And this is showing it as a percentage. And as the percentage goes up and up and up, I'm over 90%. I'm getting pretty close. The other facets, they're coming along. It's going to be a much longer road for them, particularly because, like I said, not everything can be pulled out of a subject heading. But there may be cases where things that aren't in subject headings are worth saying about, like, where a work was composed, when it was composed, things like that. So I have been tracking this as well, but not in as granular a way as the other fields. So as you can see, there's been progress. There's definitely an increase, but it's been slow. So these are screenshots from my test instance of Primo, which has 3 different facets for medium of performance. Instrumentation on the left, that's taking every individual subfield and displaying it singly. And then the middle facet is the entire statement in the 382 rendered for display. And on the right is the genre terms. So as you can see, when you search chamber music, I get many thousands of results now. It's very satisfying. Yeah, so when you get into the slides, you can access my test instance. You can play around and see what it looks like when you have, most of the score records in a catalog can be searched this way now. And we also have our production instance has a couple of these facets, but they're not all turned on yet. But I'm hoping to get them turned on in production as well. So, okay, looking at the time. Okay, good. I have a good amount of time. I want to get us into a little bit of a discussion into what the future holds. Are we there yet? Well, who is we? Are we talking about all of OCLC? Okay, let's say it. This is MOUG. The we is all of OCLC, the entire OCLC music metadata community and its stakeholders and its users. Are we, as that group, are we there yet? At what point do we say we have enough faceted data that we can consider ourselves having implemented the faceted approach in a comprehensive way? So we have to define what there looks like, because that's been, one of my pet peeves is when someone just says, oh, we're not there yet. Well, what does there look like? We have to define it. So otherwise, we won't know when we're finished. So the idea of full implementation is tricky to pin down because it depends. It depends on the format. Like I said, there are things you can assume about scores and how people look for scores that might be a little different from how people look for recorded music. And the different facets themselves might have a different, not everything necessarily needs a genre term. I'm thinking outside of music, but not everything necessarily needs a medium of performance statement. Maybe you can decide that only certain things need to have them, and then the rest of them you can let be. I mean, there are decisions that we can make individually in our institutions and that we could also make collectively. And so the question is, what can you all do? What can we all do to keep this moving forward? What can we ask OCLC to do for us? Like I was saying with the work that the ALA subcommittee has done with OCLC is that they've actually started to take a little bit of our work and incorporate it into their own macro. So maybe that's something we could do a bit more on the music side. And is there a role for AI and machine learning? Could that be the next frontier of speeding this process up by using AI? And of course, in a very judicious way, but that could be a really fun thing to explore. Second question is, how do we get this data available for use for our users, including displaying it in facets, displaying it in the body of the record, and searching capabilities and all of that. Again, I mentioned the chicken egg problem, and the different systems have different requirements, and different institutions have different policies, and so it's not going to be one size fits all, but I do think there's some commonality. I think we can start thinking about reducing duplication of effort and not reinventing wheels, and coalescing around some best practices around how to configure a facet in Primo, for instance. And you'll hear, again, more about that tomorrow at our session from Kelly and Jason, who are going to talk about what they've done in their environments. And then what could MOOC's role be around? I mean, we already, we do a lot of things in terms of that are specific to the OCLC environment, but maybe we could be a force for coalescing around some more general best practices about how to get this data working for our users. Okay, back to LCSH. What legacy practices are ready to be reassessed? And the big one is LCSH, and the big $100,000 question is, when can we stop using H1917.5 and doing all that business with creating these pattern headings that don't have authority records and all the problems that entails? But there are other things that we could look at too, like the principle of specificity. That's kind of a fundamental thing that we think about with vocabulary terms, with controlled vocabularies, is that pick the most specific term and only that term. You don't add in all the broader terms. Well, maybe that needs to be questioned a little bit. I've heard some compelling arguments that, for instance, if a user is looking for poetry and they don't want to have to remember to search all the 100 subgenres of poetry, there could be instances where we thoughtfully deviate from the principle of specificity. And we kind of already do that with the bi-level, if you've read the best practices for LCMPT, where you can have a general medium statement and then a specific statement. And then getting back to LCSH, we know that it's not a matter of dropping the entire the entire system. There are certain parts of it that we'll want to carry forward at least for a while. There's the religion issue, like how do you say this music comes out of the Buddhist tradition, but you can't really say it's created by Buddhists or just for Buddhists, but there's some relationship there, and I think we still need to figure out exactly how to express that outside of a 650, things like that. And then of course we have topical headings, which will always need to be part of the picture. So, as I said, best practices from MLA are constantly evolving, and I think that we need to, as we get more into the kind of the long tail of things beyond the obvious situations, there could be more that is articulated in the best practices. One of them that comes to my mind is, motets and things like pre-Baroque, like, is it a chorus or is it solo voices? Is it both, either? I don't know. And so there's some things that happen often enough that maybe we need more best practices around them. I won't get into the opera excerpt thing. That's another pet area, but if there's time, maybe we'll go back to that. And then finally, what are the ethical boundaries? I think the pendulum is starting to swing back from this idea of, at least with authority records, of trying to put every possible thing in. Now there's, some people are telling us to pump the brakes, and we've already, had a new policy to say don't put gender in a name authority record. And so there are other ethical questions about, like, how do we use demographic data while being respectful of, not pigeonholing or marking people and things like that. So there's a lot of thought that needs to go into that as well. So here are the prompts again. Looking at the clock, we still have 10 minutes. What do you all think? You could have questions for me as well, but I would like to hear responses to these prompts. So,
hi, thank you. The big gap for me that I see that I feel like isn't always talked about, and maybe I'm missing something about it, but the big gap for me seems to be when you have things with multiple works, such as, which mostly sound recordings, but also score compilations. It seems to me that with the faceted approach, you do lose a bit of what you get with the pre-coordinated strings now. And so I think one thing to think about is how can we replicate medium performance linked to genre form as one string referring to one work on a compilation. If there are different facets in the record for one thing, it's clear they're all referring to that same piece. But how do we replicate them, the matching and linking these together in ways that our systems can at this point can make sense out of?
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, the aggregates problem. That's a problem that we haven't solved yet, but it also isn't I don't think it's really that much worse. I know that there are some genres that can be combined with medium and an LCSH string, but not very many. There's only about 6 or 7 sonatas, suites, variations. So like those cases where you're pulling them apart, there are a lot of those cases, but there are other cases where the genre and the medium are already in separate 650s. So yeah, there's that. But yeah, we have subfield 3, we have subfield 8. We keep coming back to those, like, oh, but subfield 3 is not machine actionable, and no one uses subfield 8. Well, why don't we use it? Because no one uses it. Well, why don't we start? Because no one uses it. Yeah, that's another frontier. That's another egg we haven't cracked yet.
I really have a lot of questions, but I'll start with one. I'm thinking about institutions. Like mine is probably going to be in a couple years where I'm not sure that there will be somebody that's a music specialist working on stuff there. And so I'm just wondering what you know about what vendors might be working on to do the kinds of transformations that you've been talking about, where there may not be somebody on the staff that really knows enough about music to pull it off successfully themselves. I'm just wondering if you know any initiatives that are going on.
I think that's a great question for tomorrow's session, honestly, because we'll have, and that's not just a punt, that's because we will have people on that panel who have actually done the work of configuring display and facets, and they have also worked within the larger communities of those platforms. Like we have one for Ex Libris, Primo, and one for Blacklight on that panel. But also, like, we have this group for OCLC, for WorldCat Discovery. so we already have this mechanism to have those conversations in this community. And then like another thing that the PCC is doing is we have a new vendor consultation group where we can not only have a venue to communicate with vendors, but for vendors to communicate with each other and with us at the same time. So again, we can bring to the surface these areas of duplication of effort and maybe where we can be more aligned in our approaches. So yeah, I agree that needs to be part of the picture.
Hi. This is probably an obvious question, but as you're going through your legacy records in OCLC and upgrading them, are you then exporting them into your network zone for your consortium?
Right. So that happens automatically because we have an integration profile.
Okay.
So it's I can export and then it brings the record in immediately, but if I don't, it happens overnight automatically.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to everybody for waiting for the microphone to get to you. That makes this a very accessible event. I just want to follow up on the question about the strings. So for example, if you're looking at a sound recording and a user's like, oh, cool, this has an arrangement of something on it that I'd like to listen to, and they find out that only applies to one of 15 tracks, but then they have to go back and find something. They want to hear an arrangement of that thing, and they have to keep going through to find the one where that word arrangement in the LCGFT applies to that one track. Is there something, I recognize the subfield 3, that's my favorite subfield, but it's not somewhere you can say, okay, track 5, 10, 12, and 13 are arrangements. That wouldn't be exactly what that purpose is, and we don't want, I think it would be better to have multiple of the same genre form terms with different subfield 3s. But until we can decide that, make that happen, what do you see as the potential future for making that possible for the user?
I mean, again, it's the same conversation we've been having for years. I mean, is MARC going to be can we get this? Can we do that in MARC, or is this something that we need to put more pressure on BibFrame and other linked data applications that will make it easier for us to model, like we have one publication that has 8 different works on it, and this work has its own set of descriptive elements, and this work has its own set of descriptive, like that can be done. It's just that we can't do that in MARC, but we're still working mostly in MARC, and we don't know how viable, at least I'll speak for myself, I don't know how viable BibFrame is going to be as a short-term solution. Aggregates aren't really being given a lot of attention in BibFrame right now, to my understanding. I'd love to be proved wrong on that, but yeah, there's a lot of, I think it's broader than a MARC question, and I think the reason we haven't solved this in MARC yet is because maybe that's not the place to solve it.
Thank you. Casey, great presentation. Since you brought up BibFrame, one of the, when I talk to BibFrame developers and people at OCLC who are working on the BibFrame to MARC conversions and MARC to BibFrame conversions, the 382 field is one that they have real concerns about, and that is because it is a string. It may be faceted in its way, certainly breaks out the information that you would find in subject heading, but the fact that the subfields repeat and they are related to the subfield before it until it's an A and then it's something, or but if it's a, if it's a don't have to go through all of it. If it's if it's an instrument that could be played by the same performer, but that depends on the second movement. They play the bass clarinet instead of the B flat clarinet. All of those codes, in order for them to make sense of it in a BibFrame context, they usually there's an eye rolling moment. So is there a do we need to, because you had even mentioned earlier, there could be more subfields coming into 382 if we keep playing with it. Are we making? It feels like we're creating a Frankenstein's monster with 382 in order to have something that replaces LCSH for those forms. We're now creating something that's really specific, but almost impossible to break apart. In that sense of faceting.
Yeah, I'm not going to have time to fully unpack that. That's a great point. I think that the perform music ontology gives us some possible ways around that. But yeah, more discussion for later. I'm going to have to wrap up, so I just have a couple slides left. Shameless plug, I have a book coming out. I say more about all this stuff if you want to read it. And Kevin Kishimoto co-authored 2 chapters, including discussing PMO as a way of encoding medium data outside of MARC. So we're going to continue the conversation tomorrow with our MLA panel. You can contact me. Again, I'm not an official MLA decision maker in any of this anymore right now, but I would love to collaborate or talk about future projects with anyone. And here's the link to suggest changes to the best practices and the music toolkit, and that is it. I'm done.